The Bone Collar just subscribed for 7 months.
And if I did everything correctly, it should be okay. Yeah, I think we're good. We're good. Honestly, if it's not scuffed, is it even streaming? Is a good phrase to say. Hello, welcome back everyone. It's Vexing Cat, your local tiger librarian. We're returning to Sense and Sensibility. Here is the book cover, and this is the correct page, maybe? There we go. We're on chapter 24. Fantastic, thank you, Valis. Also, shout out to Bonecaller, thank you for the sub. 7 months. Has it even been that long? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your ongoing support. And to all of you wonderful Librophiles that are here, thank you for listening in. I think we went live on the Twitter. Maybe I'm checking that now, because knowing my luck, I don't know. I don't know. Yep, we're live on Twitter too. So we're gonna go ahead and get started here. I've got my caffeination, I've got hydration, I got a hope and a prayer. Let's get started. Chapter 24. In a firm, though cautious tone, Eleanor thus began: I should be undeserving of the confidence you have honored me with, if I felt no desire for its continuance or no farther curiosity on its subject. I will not apologize, for bringing it forward again. Thank you, cried Lucy warmly, for breaking the ice. You have set my heart at ease by it, for I was somehow or other afraid I had offended you by what I told you that Monday. Offended me? How could you suppose so? Believe me. And Eleanor spoke it with the truest sincerity. Nothing could be farther from my intention than to give you such an idea. Could you have a motive for the trust that was not honorable and flattering to me? And yet, do I assure you, replied Lucy, her little sharp eyes full of meaning, there seemed to me to be a coldness and displeasure in your manner that made me quite uncomfortable. I felt sure that you was angry with me. Ugh, you were... that sentence just... Ugh. I felt sure that you was angry with me. And having been quarreling with myself ever since, for having took such a liberty as to trouble you with my affairs. But I am very glad to find it was only my own fancy, and that you do not really blame me. If you knew what a consolation it was to me to relieve my heart by speaking to you of what I am always thinking of every moment of my life, your compassion would make you overlook everything else, I am sure. Oh, welcome in, Casman. Excellent use of the emotes. Indeed, I can easily believe that it was a very great relief to you to acknowledge your situation to me, and be assured that you shall never have reason to repent it. Your case is a very unfortunate one. You seem to me to be surrounded with difficulties, and you will have need of all your mutual affection to support you under them. Mr. Ferrars, I believe, is entirely dependent on his mother. He has only 2,000 pounds of his own. It would be madness to marry upon that, though for my own part I could give up every prospect of more without a sigh. I have been always used to a very small income, and could struggle with any poverty for him, but I love him too well to be the selfish means of robbing him, perhaps, of all that his mother might give him if he married to please her. We must wait. It may be for many years. With almost every other man in the world, it would be an alarming prospect, but Edward's affection and constancy nothing can deprive me of, I know. That conviction must be everything to you, and he is undoubtedly supported by the same trust in yours. If the strength of your reciprocal attachment had failed, as between many people and under many circumstances, it naturally would during a 4 years' engagement. Your situation would have been pitiable indeed. Lucy here looked up, but Eleanor was careful in guarding her countenance from every expression that could give her words a suspicious tendency. Edward's love for me, said Lucy, has been pretty well put to the test by our long, very long absence since we were first engaged, and it has stood the trial so well that I should be unpardonable to doubt it now. I can safely say that he has never gave me one moment's alarm on that account from the first. Eleanor hardly knew whether to smile or sigh at this assertion. Lucy went on. I am rather of a jealous temper, too, by nature, and from our different situations in life, from his being so much more in the world than me, and our continual separation, I was enough inclined for suspicion to have found out the truth in an instant, if there had been the slightest alteration in his behavior to me when we met, or any lowness of spirits that I could not account for, or if he had talked more of one lady than another, or seemed in any respect less happy at Longstaple than he used to be. I do not mean to say that I am particularly observant or quick-sighted in general, but in such a case I am sure I could not be deceived. All this, thought Eleanor, is very pretty, but it can impose upon neither of us. But what, said she, after a short silence, are your views, or have you none but that of waiting for Mrs. Ferrars's death, which is a melancholy and shocking extremity? Is her son determined to submit to this, and to all the tediousness of the many years of suspense in which it may involve you, rather than run the risk of her displeasure for a while by owning the truth? Hi, Tiger Faye, welcome in. Oh, thank you for the head pats. It would be certain, if we could be certain, that it would be only for a while, but Mrs. Ferrars is a very headstrong, proud woman, and in her first fit of anger upon hearing it, would very likely secure everything to Robert, and the idea of that, for Edward's sake, frightens away all my inclination for hasty measures. And for your own sake, too. Or you are carrying your disinterestedness. Ooh, that's a one. And for your own sake, too, or you are carrying your disinterestedness beyond reason. Lucy looked at Eleanor again and was silent. Do you know Mr. Robert Ferrars? Asked Eleanor. Not at all. I never saw him, but I fancy he is very unlike his brother. Silly, and a great coxcomb. A great coxcomb, repeated Miss Steele, whose ear had caught those words by a sudden pause in Marianne's music. Oh, they are talking of their favorite beau, I dare say. No, sister, cried Lucy, you are mistaken there. Our favorite beaux are not great coxcombs. I can answer for it that Miss Dashwood's is not, said Mrs. Jennings, laughing heartily, for he is one of the modestest, prettiest behaved young men I ever saw. But as for Lucy, she is such a sly little creature, there is no finding out who she likes. Oh, cried Miss Steele, looking significantly round at them. I dare say Lucy's beau is quite as modest and pretty behaved as Miss Dashwood's. Oh, no. Eleanor blushed in spite of herself. Lucy bit her lip and looked angrily at her sister. A mutual silence took place for some time. Lucy first put an end to it by saying in a lower tone, though Marianne was then giving them the powerful protection of a very magnificent concerto. Google is just struggling today. I will honestly tell you of one scheme which has lately come into my head for bringing matters to bear. Indeed, I am bound to let you into the secret, for you are a party concerned. I dare say you have seen enough of Edward to know that he would prefer the church to every other profession. Now, my plan is that he should take orders as soon as he can, and then through your interest, which I am sure you would be kind enough to use out of friendship for him, and I hope out of some regard to me, your brother might be persuaded to give him Norland a living, which I understand is a very good one, and the present incumbent not likely to live a great while. That would be enough for us to marry upon, and we might trust to time and chance for the rest. I should be always happy, replied Eleanor, to shew any mark of my esteem and friendship for Mr. Ferrars, but you, but do not, but do not you perceive that my interest on such an occasion would be perfectly unnecessary? He is brother to Mrs. John Dashwood. That must be recommendation enough to her husband. But Mrs. John Dashwood would not much approve of Edward's going into orders. Then I rather suspect that my interest would do very little. They were again silent for many minutes. At length Lucy exclaimed with a deep sigh, I believe it would be the wisest way to put an end to the business at once by dissolving the engagement. We seem to be beset with difficulties on every side, that though it would make us miserable for a time, we should be happier perhaps in the end. But you will not give me your advice, Miss Dashwood? No, answered Eleanor, with a smile which concealed very agitated feelings. On such a subject I certainly will not. You know very well that my opinion would have no weight with you, unless it were on the side of your wishes. Indeed, you wrong me, replied Lucy with great solemnity. I know nobody of whose judgment I think so highly as I do of yours, and I do really believe that if you was to say to me, I advise you by all means to put an end to your engagement with Edward Ferrars, it will be more for the happiness of both of you. I should resolve upon doing it immediately. Eleanor blushed for the insincerity of Edward's future wife, and replied, This compliment would effectually frighten me for giving any opinion on the subject. Had I formed one, it raises my influence much too high. The power of dividing two people so tenderly attached is too much for an indifferent person. 'Tis because you are indifferent person. 'Tis because you are an indifferent person, said Lucy, with some pique, and laying a particular stress on those words, that your judgment might justly have such weight with me, if you could be supposed to be biased in any respect by your own feelings, your opinion would not be worth having. Eleanor thought it wisest to make no answer to this, lest they might provoke each other to an unsuitable increase of ease and unreserve, and was even partly determined never to mention the subject again. Another pause, therefore of many minutes' duration, succeeded this speech, and Lucy was still the first to end it. Shall you be in town this winter, Miss Dashwood? Said she, with all her accustomed complacency. Certainly not. I am sorry for that, returned the other, while her eyes brightened at the information. It would have given me such pleasure to meet you there, but I dare say you will go for all that. To be sure, your brother and sister will ask you to come to them. Hi, Zeno, welcome in. It will not be in my power to accept their invitation if they do. How unlucky that is. I had quite depended upon meeting you there. Anne and me are to go the latter end of January to some relations who have been wanting us to visit them these several years, but I only go for the sake of seeing Edward. He will be there in February. Otherwise, London would have no charms for me. I have not spirits for it. Eleanor was soon called to the card table. By the conclusion of the first rubber, and the confidential discourse of the two ladies was therefore at an end, to which both of them submitted without any reluctance, for nothing had been said on either side to make them dislike each other less than they had done before, and Eleanor sat down to the card table with the melancholy persuasion that Edward was not only without affection for the person who was to be his wife, but that he had not even the chance of being tolerably happy in marriage, which sincere affection on her side would have given, for self-interest alone could induce a woman to keep a man to an engagement of which she seemed so thoroughly aware that he was weary. I am doing as well as I can, Zeno. Thank you for asking. I hope you are doing well as well. Does that read well? I hope you're doing well as well. I don't know. English is weird. What category am I in? You said change my category? We have an official one. Well, what is it called, you silly goose? Well, what link? Link? Select content label. Reading fun? Writing and reading? Oh, okay. Let me fix that. Ooh. That's cool. It's got a picture. Oh, that's so pretty. Yay! That is so nice. Okay. I'll update. I'm pretty excited. I like that it has a picture. It's a bookmark. It's lovely. I am not 100% sure, but I think that might be the book cover of I read it last fall. What was it called? Treasure Island was red. It was one of the gold ones. I'll have to think about it. But that is so exciting. Yeah, I'm really stoked, Neff. That's awesome. Thank you for that information. Okay, we were on the second paragraph. There we go. Thank you for that. And I will start reading exclusively under writing and reading, unless it's like an ASMR related content, blah, blah, blah. But okay, let's get cooking. From this... I'm so distracted. We have a category. Oh, I'm so happy. It's so dumb, but I'm so happy. If you're not already following the category, you guys, check out writing and reading. I think that's pretty clever. It feels very vindicated. We're not just some random gray icon of reading fun, which I'm pretty sure might have been a game at one point in time. I don't even know. But we made it our own, and I am happy that this is the category. It's very exciting. Okay. All right, we updated that. We are closing out of that. Fancy category. Yes. Okay, focus in. We're finishing chapter 24. Okay. From this time, the subject was never revived by Eleanor, and when entered on by Lucy, who seldom missed an opportunity of introducing it, and was particularly careful to inform her confidant of her happiness whenever she received a letter from Edward, it was treated by the former with calmness and caution, and dismissed as soon as civility would allow, for she felt such conversations to be an indulgence which Lucy did not deserve, and which were dangerous to herself. The visit of the Miss Steeles at Barton Park was lengthened far beyond what the first invitation implied. Their favor increased. They could not be spared. Sir John would not hear of their going, and in spite of their numerous and long-arranged engagements in Exeter, in spite of the absolute necessity of their returning to fulfill them immediately, which was in full force at the end of every week, they were prevailed on to stay nearly 2 months at the park, and to assist in the due celebration of that festival which requires a more than ordinary share of private balls and large dinners to proclaim its importance. All right. You don't know how to do either of which things, you know. Change the category? You must. Okay, chapter. Boop. So we're going to go on to writing or reading. I don't know how to do either of those things. Writing or, well, you are a crocodile. You know, an artist crocodile. So needing to be able to read is only required when you play certain games. I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure your handler takes care of the rest. Oh, man. So I just finished off. I don't normally drink soda, but I bought this ginger beer by Northwest Soda Works, Bedford's. And it's like I think an English style ginger beer, and it was very spicy. And I quite enjoyed it, but it is done now. All right, so directory. If you go to the Twitch/director wait, if you go to Twitch/director/category/writing and reading, they'll give you a follow category option. Let's do that. Twitch slash talk about moving. It did it for me. It's thinking, it's cooking my CPU. Ooh, fancy. Look at it. I'm so excited. Boop. All right. I should put that on the... Paste that in the side chat here. This one's spicy. Goth girl, funny mommy. Well, maybe we'll raid into them later if they're still on. Okay. So we're on to chapter 25 of Sense and Sensibility. Though Mrs. Jennings was in the habit of spending a large portion of the year at the houses of her children and friends, she was not without a settled habitation of her own. Since the death of her husband, who had traded with success in a less elegant part of the town, she had resided every winter in a house in one of the streets near Portman Square. Towards this home she began, on the approach of January, to turn her thoughts, and thither she one day abruptly and very unexpectedly by them asked the elder Miss Dashwoods to accompany her, Eleanor, without observing... asked the elder Miss Dashwoods to accompany her. Eleanor, without observing the varying complexion of her sister, and the animated look which spoke no indifference to the plan, immediately gave a grateful but absolute denial for both, in which she believed herself to be speaking their united inclinations. The reason alleged was their determined resolution of not leaving their mother at that time of year. Mrs. Jennings received the refusal with some surprise, and repeated her invitation immediately. "Oh, Lord, I am sure your mother can spare you very well, and I do beg you will favor me with your company, for I've quite set my heart upon it. Don't fancy that you will be any inconvenience to me, for I shan't put myself at all out of my way for you. It will only be sending Betty by the coach. Interesting. It will only be sending Betty by the coach, and I hope I can afford that. We three shall be able to go very well in my chaise. And when we are in town, if you do not like to go wherever I do, well and good. You may always go with one of my daughters. I am sure your mother will not object to it, for I have had such good luck in getting my own children off my hands that she will think me a very fit person to have the charge of you. And if I don't get one of you at least well married before I have done with you, it shall not be my fault. I shall speak a good word for you to all the young men, you may depend upon it. Ah, welcome in, thank you. Always enjoy a good little bit of head pats. Those are so sweet. I have a notion, said Mr. John, that Miss Marianne would not object to such a scheme, if her elder sister would come into it. It is very hard indeed that she should not have a little pleasure, because Miss Dashwood does not wish it. So I would advise you to set off for town when you are tired of Barton, without saying a word to Miss Dashwood about it. Nay, cried Mrs. Jennings, I am sure I shall be monstrous glad of Miss Marianne's company, whether Miss Dashwood will go or not. Only the more the merrier, Only the more the merrier, say I, and I thought it would be more comfortable for them to be together, because if they got tired of me, they might talk to one another, and laugh at my odd ways behind my back. But one or the other, if not both of them, I must have. Lord bless me, how do you think I can live poking by myself, I who have always used till this winter. That's such a weird sentence. I who have always used I who have always used till this winter to have Charlotte with me. Come, Miss Marianne, let us strike hands upon the bargain, and if Miss Dashwood will change her mind by and by, why, so much the better. I thank you, ma'am, sincerely thank you, said Marianne with warmth. Your invitation has served my gratitude forever. Well, that just doesn't sound right. I must insured. There we go. Has insured my gratitude forever, and it would give me such happiness, yes, almost the greatest happiness I am capable of, to be able to accept it. But my mother, my dearest, kindest mother, I feel the justice of what Eleanor has urged, and if she were to be made less happy, less comfortable by our absence, oh, no, nothing should tempt me to leave her. It should not, must not be a struggle. Hi, welcome in. Mrs. Jennings repeated her assurance that Mrs. Dashwood could spare them perfectly well, and Eleanor, who now understood her sister and saw to what indifference to almost everything else she was carried by her eagerness to be with Willoughby again, made no farther direct opposition to the plan, and merely referred it to her mother's decision, from whom, however, she scarcely expected to receive any support in her endeavour to prevent a visit which she could not approve of for Marianne, and which, on her own accord, she had particular reasons to avoid. Whatever Marianne was desirous of, her mother would be eager to promote. She could not expect to influence the latter to cautiousness of conduct.
Igara 13 gifted 2 subscriptions to the community.
Aw, thank you, Higara. Thank you so much. 2 gifted subs, turning in your books late. I think that's the ongoing joke. Holy sub bomb, yes, yes. Sino, enjoy your emotes. Gothgash, also I hope you enjoy your emotes. Okay, I lost my train of thought there just for a second. My goodness, thank you for the gifted subs. Your continued support is essential. Thank you. There we go. Whatever Marianne was desirous of, her mother would be eager to promote. She could not expect to influence the latter to cautiousness of conduct in an affair respecting which she had never been able to inspire her with distrust.
My revealer just followed.
Thank you for the follow. May Ravelia. Beautiful name. And she dared not explain to motive of her own disinclination for going to London. That Marianne, fastidious as she was, thoroughly acquainted with Mrs. Jennings' manners, and invariably disgusted by them, should overlook every inconvenience of that kind, should disregard whatever must be most wounding to her irritable feelings in her pursuit of one object, was such a proof so strong, so full of the importance of that object to her, as Eleanor, in spite of all that had passed, was not prepared to witness. On being informed of the invitation, Mrs. Dashwood, persuaded that one follow after another. Wonderful, thank you. In her pursuit of one object was such a proof so strong, so full of the importance of that object to her, as Eleanor, in spite of all that had passed, was not prepared to witness. On being informed of the invitation, Mrs. Dashwood, persuaded that such an excursion would be productive of much amusement to both her daughters, and perceiving through all her affectionate attention to herself how much the heart of Marianne was in it, would not hear of their declining the offer upon her account, insisted on their both accepting it directly, and then began to foresee, with her usual cheerfulness, a variety of advantages that would accrue to them all from this separation. "I am delighted with the plan," she cried. "It is exactly what I could wish. Margaret and I shall be as much benefited by it as yourselves. When you and the Middletons are gone, we shall go on so quietly and happily together, with our books and our music. You will find Margaret so improved when you come back, and I have a little plan of alteration for your bedrooms too, which may now be performed without inconvenience to anyone. It is very right that you should go to town. I would have every young woman of your condition in life acquainted with the manners and amusements of London. You will be under the care of a motherly, good sort of woman, of whose kindness to you I can have no doubt, and in all probability you will see your brother, and whatever may be his faults, or the faults of his wife. When I consider whose son he is, I cannot bear to have you so wholly estranged from each other. Though, with your usual anxiety for our happiness," said Eleanor, "you have been obviating every impediment You have been obviating every impediment to the present scheme which occurred to you. There is still one objection which, in my opinion, cannot be so easily removed." Marianne's countenance sunk. "And what," said Mrs. Dashwood, "is my dear prudent Eleanor going to suggest? What formidable obstacle is she now to bring forward? Do not let me hear a word about the expense of it." "My objection is this. Though I think very well of Mrs. Jennings' heart, she is not a woman whose society can afford us pleasure, or whose protection will give us consequence. Thank you for lurking, Fox. That is very true, replied her mother. But of her society separately from that of other people, you will scarcely have anything at all, and you will almost always appear in public with Lady Middleton. If Eleanor is frightened away by her dislike of Mrs. Jennings, said Marianne, at least it need not prevent my accepting her invitation. I have no such scruples, and I am sure I could put up with every unpleasantness of that kind with very little effort. Eleanor could not help smiling at this display of indifference towards the manners of a person to whom she had often had difficulty in persuading Marianne to behave with tolerable politeness, and resolved within herself that if her sister persisted in going, she would go likewise, as she did not think it proper that Marianne should be left to the sole guidance of her own judgment, or that Mrs. Jennings should be abandoned to the mercy of Marianne for all the comfort of her domestic hours. To the determination she was the more easily reconciled. To this determination she was more right. Today, Wednesday, right. Okay, one more time. Into the brink. To this determination she was the more easily reconciled by recollecting that Edward Ferrars, by Lucy's account, was not to be in town before February, and that their visit, without any unreasonable abridgment, might be previously finished. I will have you both go, said Mrs. Dashwood. These objections are nonsensical. You will have much pleasure in being in London, and especially in being together. And if Eleanor would ever condescend to anticipate enjoyment, she would foresee it there from a variety of sources. She would perhaps expect some from improving her acquaintance with her sister-in-law's family. Eleanor had often wished for an opportunity of attempting to weaken her mother's dependence on the attachment of Edward and herself, that the shock might be the less when the whole truth was revealed. And now on this attack, though almost hopeless of success, she forced herself to begin her design by saying, as calmly as she could, I like Edward Ferrars very much, and shall always be glad to see him. But as to the rest of the family, it is a matter of perfect indifference to me whether I am ever known to them or not. Mrs. Dashwood smiled and said nothing. Marianne lifted up her eyes in astonishment, and Eleanor conjectured that she might as well have held her tongue. After very little farther discourse, it was finally settled that the invitation should be fully accepted. Mrs. Jennings received the information with a great deal of joy and many assurances of kindness and care. Nor was it a matter of pleasure merely to her. Sir John was delighted, for to a man whose prevailing anxiety was the dread of being alone, the acquisition of 2 to the number of inhabitants in London was something. Even Lady Middleton took the trouble of being delighted, which was putting herself rather out of her way. And as for the Miss Steeles, especially Lucy, they had never been so happy in their lives as this intelligence made them. Oh, welcome in, Shio. Oh, you're another VTuber. That's awesome. Eleanor submitted to the arrangement which counteracted her wishes with less reluctance than she had expected to feel. With regard to herself, it was now a matter of unconcern whether she went to town or not. And when she saw her mother so thoroughly pleased with the plan, and her sister exhilarated by it in look, voice, and manner, restored to her to all her usual animation, and elevated to more than her usual gaiety, she could not be dissatisfied with the cause, and would hardly allow herself to distrust the consequence. Marianne's joy was almost a degree beyond happiness. So great was the perturbation. Man, she loves that word. So great was the perturbation of her spirits and her impatience to be gone. Her unwillingness to quit her mother was her only restorative to calmness. And at the moment of parting, her grief on that score was excessive. Her mother's affliction was hardly less, and Eleanor was the only one of the three who seemed to consider the separation as anything short of eternal. Their departure took place in the first week in January. The Middletons were to follow in about a week. The Miss Steeles kept their station at the park, and were to quit it only with the rest of the family. Shioviti. Hi, love reading books too. Will listen while sewing. Oh, that's lovely. We're reading under a new category today. They just made it. It's called Writing and Reading. It's pretty exciting. If you haven't checked out the category, it's pretty new. I think there's only like 35 followers, but it actually has a proper image for it, unlike Reading Fun, which has been a gaming console icon on a gray background for ages. So we're super stoked, and you can thank Neff for that information. So let's see here. We're on to... Oh yeah, I've done a couple of fairy tales. It's just something nice to do, and I do primarily reading streams, so it's nice to have a permanent home to call our own, you know. We're on... Absolutely. We're on to chapter 26 of Sense and Sensibility. Eleanor could not find herself in the carriage with Mrs. Jennings, and beginning a journey to London under her protection, and as her guest, without wondering at her own situation. So short had their acquaintance with that lady been, so wholly unsuited were they in age and disposition, and so many had been her objections against such a measure only a few days before. But these objections had, all with that happy ardor of youth which Marianne and her mother equally shared, been overcome or overlooked. And Eleanor, in spite of every occasional doubt of Willoughby's constancy, could not witness the rapture of delightful expectation which filled the whole soul and beamed in the eyes of Marianne, without feeling how blank with her own prospect, how cheerless her own state of mind in the comparison. Without feeling how blank was her own prospect, how cheerless her own state of mind in the comparison, and how gladly she would engage in the solicitude of Marianne's situation, to have the same animating object in view, the same possibility of hope. A very short time, however, must now decide what Willoughby's intentions were. In all probability, he was already in town. Marianne's eagerness to be gone declared her dependence on finding him there. And Eleanor was resolved not only upon gaining every new light as to his character, which her own observation or the intelligence of others could give her, but likewise upon watching his behavior to her sister with such zealous attention as to ascertain what he was and what he meant, before many meetings had taken place. Should the result of her observations be unfavorable, she was determined at all events to open the eyes of her sister. Should it be otherwise, her exertions would be of different nature. She must then learn to avoid every selfish comparison, and banish every regret which might lessen her satisfaction in the happiness of Marianne. They were 3 days on their journey, and Marianne's behavior as they traveled was a happy specimen of what her future what her future complacence and companionableness to Mrs. Jennings might be expected to be. She sat in silence almost all the way, wrapped in her own meditations, and scarcely ever voluntarily speaking, except when any object of picturesque beauty within their view drew from her an exclamation of delight exclusively addressed to her sister. To atone for this conduct, therefore, Eleanor took immediate possession of the post of civility which she had assigned herself, behaved with the greatest attention to Mrs. Jennings, talked with her, laughed with her, and listened to her whenever she could. And Mrs. Jennings, on her side, treated them both with all possible kindness, was solicitous on every occasion for their ease and enjoyment, and only disturbed that she could not make them choose their own dinners at the inn, nor extort a confession of their preferring salmon to cod, or boiled fowls to veal cutlets. They reached town by 3 o'clock the third day, glad to be released after such a journey from the confinement of a carriage, and ready to enjoy all the luxury of a good fire. The house was handsome and handsomely fitted up, and the ladies were immediately put in possession of a very comfortable apartment. It had formerly been Charlotte's, and over the mantelpiece still hung a landscape in colored silks of her performance, in proof of her having spent 7 years at a great school in town to some effect. As dinner was not to be ready in less than 2 hours from their arrival, Eleanor determined to employ the interval in writing to her mother, and sat down for that purpose. In a few moments, Marianne did the same. "I am writing home, Marianne," said Eleanor. "Had not you better defer your letter for a day or two?" "I am not going to write to my mother," replied Marianne hastily, and as if wishing to avoid any farther inquiry, Eleanor said no more. It immediately struck her that she must be writing to Willoughby, and the conclusion which was instantly followed was, that however mysteriously they might wish to conduct the affair, they must be engaged. This conviction, though not entirely satisfactory, gave her pleasure, and she continued her letter with greater alacrity. Marianne's was finished in a very few minutes. In length it could be no more than a note. It was then folded up, sealed, and directed with eager rapidity. Eleanor thought she could distinguish a large W in the direction. And no sooner was it complete than Marianne, ringing the bell, requested the footman who answered it to get the letter conveyed for her to the 2-penny post. This decided the matter at once. Her spirits still continued very high. "Oh, welcome in, Almontes." Thank you for the head pats. Her spirits still continued very high, but there was a flutter in them which prevented their giving much pleasure to her sister. And this agitation increased as the evening drew on. She could scarcely eat any dinner, and when they afterwards returned to the drawing-room, seemed anxiously listening to the sound of every carriage. It was a great satisfaction to Eleanor that Mrs. Jennings, by being much engaged in her own room, could see little of what was passing. The tea things were brought in, and already had Marianne been disappointed more than once by a rap at her neighboring door, when a loud one was suddenly heard which could not be mistaken for one at any other house. Eleanor felt secure of its announcing Willoughby's approach, and Marianne, starting up, moved towards the door. Everything was silent. This could not be borne many seconds. She opened the door, advanced a few steps towards the stairs, and after listening half a minute, returned into the room in all the agitation which a conviction of having heard him would naturally produce. In the ecstasy of her feelings at that instant, she could not help exclaiming, "Oh, Eleanor, it is Willoughby, indeed it is," and seemed almost ready to throw herself into his arms, when Colonel Brandon appeared. It was too great a shock to be borne with calmness, and she immediately left the room. Eleanor was disappointed too, but at the same time her regard for Colonel Brandon ensured his welcome with her, and she felt particularly hurt that a man so partial to her sister should perceive that she experienced nothing but grief and disappointment in seeing him. She instantly saw that it was not unnoticed by him, that he even observed Marianne as she quitted the room with such astonishment and concern as hardly left him the recollection of what civility demanded towards herself. "Is your sister ill?" said he. Eleanor answered in some distress that she was, and then talked of headaches, low spirits, and over-fatigues, and everything to which she could decently attribute her sister's behavior. He heard her with the most earnest attention, but, seeming to recollect himself, he said no more on the subject, and began directly to speak of his pleasure at seeing them in London, making the usual inquiries about their journey and the friends they had left behind. In this calm kind of way, with very little interest on either side, they continued to talk, both of them out of spirits, and the thoughts of both engaged elsewhere. Eleanor wished very much to ask whether Willoughby were then in town, but she was afraid of giving him pain by any inquiry after his arrival, and at length, by way of saying something, she asked if he had been in London ever since she had seen him last. "Yes," he replied with some embarrassment, "almost ever since. I have been once or twice at Delaford for a few days, but it has never been in my power to return to Barton." This, and the manner in which it was said, immediately brought back to her remembrance all the circumstances of his quitting that place, with the uneasiness and suspicions they had caused to Mrs. Jennings, and she was fearful that her question had implied much more curiosity on the subject than she had ever felt. Mrs. Jennings soon came in. "Oh, Colonel," said she, with her usual noisy cheerfulness, "I am monstrous glad to see you. Sorry I could not come before. Beg your pardon, but I have been forced to look about me a little and settle my matters, and for it is a long while since I have been at home, and you know one has always a world of little odd things to do after one has been away for any time, and then I have had Cartwright to settle with. Lord, I have been as busy as a bee ever since dinner. But pray, Colonel, how came you to conjure out that I should be in town today?" "I had the pleasure of hearing it at Mr. Palmer's, where I have been where I have been dining." "Oh, you did? Well, and how do they all do at their house? How does Charlotte do? I warrant you she is a fine size by this time." "Mrs. Palmer appeared quite well, and I am commissioned to tell you that you will certainly see her tomorrow." "Ay, to be sure, I thought as much. Well, Colonel, I have brought 2 young ladies with me, you see. That is, you see but one of them now, but there is another somewhere. Your friend Miss Marianne, too, which you will not be sorry to hear. I do not know what you and Mr. Willoughby will do between you about her. Ay, it is a fine thing to be young and handsome. Well, I was young once, and then I took an arrow to the knee. But I never was very handsome. Worse luck for me. However, I got a very good husband, and I don't know what the greatest beauty can do more. Ah, poor man. He has been dead these 8 years and better. But, Colonel, where have you been to since we parted, and how does your business go on? Come, come, let's have no secrets among friends. He replied with his customary mildness to all her inquiries, but without satisfying her in any. Eleanor now began to make the tea, and Marianne was obliged to appear again. After her entrance, Colonel Brandon became more thoughtful and silent than he had been before, and Mrs. Jennings could not prevail on him to stay long. No other visitor appeared that evening, and the ladies were unanimous in agreeing to go early to bed. Marianne rose the next morning with recovered spirits and happy looks. The disappointment of the evening before seemed forgotten in the expectation of what was to happen that day. They had not long finished their breakfast before Mrs. Palmer's barouche stopped at the door, and in a few minutes she came laughing into the room, so delighted to see them all that it was hard to say whether she received most pleasure from meeting her mother or the Miss Dashwoods again. She so surprised at their coming to town that it was what she had rather expected all along, so angry at their accepting her mother's invitation after having declined her own, though at the same time she would never have forgiven them if they had not come. "Mr. Palmer will be so happy to see you." "Will he?" said she. "What do you think he said when he heard of your coming with mamma? I forget what it was now, but it was something so droll." After an hour or two spent in what her mother called comfortable chat, quote unquote, or in other words, in every variety of inquiry concerning all their acquaintance on Mrs. Jennings' side, and in laughter without cause on Mrs. Palmer's, it was proposed by the latter that they should all accompany her to some shops where she had business that morning, to which Mrs. Jennings and Eleanor readily consented, and as having likewise some purchases to make themselves, and Marianne, though declining it at first, was induced to go likewise. Wherever they went, she was evidently always on the watch. In Bond Street especially, where much of their business lay, her eyes were in constant inquiry, and in whatever shop the party were engaged, her mind was equally abstracted from everything actually before them, from all that interested and occupied the others. Restless and dissatisfied everywhere, her sister could never obtain her opinion of any article of purchase, however it might equally concern them both. She received no pleasure from anything, was only impatient to be at home again, and could with difficulty govern her vexation at the tediousness of Mrs. Palmer, whose eye was caught by everything pretty, expensive, or new, who was wild to buy all, could determine on none, and dawdled away her time in rapture and indecision. I would dare say that Mrs. Palmer likes to window shop. Rapture and indecision. Can't make a decision. She loves everything. I know that. Big mood. Really big mood. It was late in the morning before they returned home, and no sooner had they entered the house than Marianne flew eagerly upstairs. And when Eleanor followed, she found her turning from the table with a sorrowful countenance, which declared that no Willoughby had been there. "Has no letter been left here for me since we went out?" said she to the footman, who then entered with the parcels. She was answered in the negative. "Are you quite sure of it?" she replied. "Are you certain that no servant, no porter has left any letter or note?" The man replied that none had. "How very odd," said she in a low and disappointed voice as she turned away to the window. "How odd indeed," repeated Eleanor within herself, regarding her sister with uneasiness. If she had not known him to be in town, she would not have written to him as she did. She would have written to Combe Magna. And if he was in town, how odd that he should neither come nor write. Oh, my dear mother, you must be wrong in permitting an engagement between a daughter so young, a man so little known, to be carried on in so doubtful, so mysterious a manner. I long to inquire. I long to inquire, but how will my interference be borne? She determined, after some consideration, that if appearances continued many days longer as unpleasant as they now were, she would represent in the strongest manner to her mother the necessity of some serious inquiry into the affair.
Sleepyhead 33 just followed.
Ah, welcome in. Thank you for the follow, Sleepyhead. Mrs. Palmer and two elderly ladies of Mrs. Jennings' intimate acquaintance, whom she had met and invited in the morning, dined with them. The former left them soon after tea to fulfill her evening engagements, and Eleanor was obliged to assist in making a whist table for the others. Marianne was of no use on these occasions, as she would never learn the game. But though her time was therefore at her own disposal, the evening was by no means more productive of pleasure to her than to Eleanor, for it was a disappointment. For it was spent in all the anxiety of expectation and the pain of disappointment. She sometimes endeavored for a few minutes to read, but the book was soon thrown aside, hopefully not literally, and she returned to the more interesting employment of walking backwards and forwards across the room, pausing for a moment whenever she came to the window in hopes of distinguishing the long-expected rap. Okay, we are between chapters. I am due for an ad break. I'm going to go ahead and take a short 3-minute ad break, and then that way we should hopefully be able to go at least another hour without having to worry about it. Yes, Sleepyhead, we actually have a new category now. If you have not seen it, give it a follow. We're going to start directing all of the booktubers and reading streamers that we know to the category writing and reading. It's brand new. It has a really cute little image of a bookmark in a book. I really like it. It's a nice departure from reading fun or ASMR, which never really felt right for reading categories. But let's go on a quick break, like I said, and when we come back, we'll start on chapter 27. Alley-oop. Okay, we are back to the book. There we go. Alright, so we're going to be starting on chapter 27, which is not quite halfway through the book, but we're getting there. We'll be past half after today. So chapter 27. There we go. Also, welcome back, all you wonderful Librophiles.
Drink water.
Yes.
Become.
Hydrate.
Don't forget to stretch.
Putting those points to use, I see. Big stretch. Yep. Okay. Neck too while I'm at it. Okay, there we go. So we are returning to Sense and Sensibility, chapter 27.
Drink water. Become.
Gary. All right, more water. My goodness. You guys are ensuring that I stay hydrated. I appreciate it, though. Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Valis. All right. Let's hop to it. Chapter 27. If this open weather holds much longer, said Mrs. Jennings, when they met at breakfast the following morning, Sir John will not like leaving Barton next week. 'Tis a sad thing for sportsmen to lose a day's pleasure. Poor souls, I always pity them when they do. They seem to take it so much to heart. Welcome in, Devi. I hope you're doing well. That is true, cried Marianne in a cheerful voice, and walking to the window as she spoke, to examine the day. I had not thought of that. This weather will keep many sportsmen in the country. It was a lucky recollection. All her good spirits were restored by it. It is charming weather for them, indeed, she continued as she sat down to the breakfast table with a happy countenance. How much they must enjoy it! But, with a little return of anxiety, it cannot be expected to last long. At this time of year, and after such a series of rain, we shall certainly have very little more of it. Frost will soon set in, and in all probability with severity. In another day or two, perhaps. This extreme mildness can hardly last longer, nay, perhaps it may freeze tonight. Ah, thank you, Debbie. Thank you for the lurk. At any rate, said Eleanor, wishing to prevent Mrs. Jennings from seeing her sister's thoughts as clearly as she did, I dare say we shall have Sir John and Lady Middleton in town by the end of the week. Ay, my dear, I'll warrant you we do. Mary always has her own way. And now, silently conjectured Eleanor, she will write to Combe by this day's post. But if she did, the letter was written and sent away with a privacy that eluded all her watchfulness to ascertain the fact. Whatever the truth of it might be, and as far as Eleanor was from feeling thorough contentment about it, yet, while she saw Marianne in spirits, she could not be very uncomfortable herself. And Marianne was in spirits, happy in the mildness of the weather, and still happier in her expectation of a frost. The morning was chiefly spent in leaving cards at the houses of Mrs. Jennings' acquaintance to inform them of her being in town, and Marianne was all the time busy in observing the direction of the wind, watching the variations of the sky, and imagining an alteration in the air. Don't you find it colder than it was in the morning, Eleanor? There seems to me a very decided difference. I can hardly keep my hands warm even in my muff. It was not so yesterday, I think. The clouds seem parting too. The sun will be out in a moment, and we shall have a clear afternoon. Eleanor was alternatively diverted and pained, but Marianne persevered and saw every night in the brightness of the fire the certain symptoms of approaching frost. The Miss Dashwoods had no greater reason to be dissatisfied with Mrs. Jennings' style of living and set of acquaintances than with her behavior to themselves, which was invariably kind. Everything in her household arrangements was conducted on the most liberal plan, and excepting a few old city friends whom, to Lady Middleton's regret, she had never dropped, she visited no one to whom an introduction could at all discompose the feelings of her young companions. Pleased to find herself more comfortably situated in that particular than she had expected, Eleanor was very willing to compound for the want of much real enjoyment from any of their evening parties, which, whether at home or abroad, formed only for cards and could have little to amuse her. Colonel Brandon, who had a general invitation to the house, was with them almost every day. He came to look at Marianne and talk to Eleanor, who often derived more satisfaction from conversing with him than from any other daily occurrence, but who saw at the same time with much concern his continued regard for her sister. She feared it was a strengthening regard. It grieved her to see the earnestness with which he often watched Marianne, and his spirits were certainly worse than when at Barton. About a week after their arrival, it became certain that Willoughby was also arrived. His card was on the table when they came in from the morning's drive. "Good God!" cried Marianne. "He has been here while we were out." Eleanor, rejoiced to be assured of his being in London now, ventured to say, "Depend upon it, he will call again tomorrow." Marianne seemed hardly to hear her, and on Mrs. Jennings' entrance escaped with the precious card. This event, while it raised the spirits of Eleanor, restored to those of her sister all, and more than all, their former agitation. From this moment her mind was never quiet. The expectation of seeing him every hour of the day made her unfit for anything. She insisted on being left behind the next morning when the others went out. Eleanor's thoughts were full of what might be passing in Berkeley Street during their absence. But a moment's glance at her sister when they returned was enough to inform her that Willoughby had paid no second visit there. A note was just then brought in and laid on the table. "For me?" cried Marianne, stepping hastily forward. "No, ma'am, for my mistress." But Marianne, not convinced, took it instantly up. "It is indeed for Mrs. Jennings. How provoking!" "You are expecting a letter, then?" said Eleanor, unable to be longer silent. "Yes, a little, not much." After a short pause, "You have no confidence in me, Marianne." "Nay, Eleanor, this reproach from you who have confidence in no one." "Me?" returned Eleanor in some confusion. "Indeed, Marianne, I have nothing to tell." "Nor I," answered Marianne with energy. "Our situations, then, are alike. We have neither of us anything to tell, you because you communicate, and I because I conceal nothing." Eleanor, distressed by this charge of reserve in herself, which she was not at liberty to do anyway, knew not how, under such circumstances, to press for greater openness in Marianne. Mrs. Jennings soon appeared, and the note being given to her, she read it aloud. It was from Lady Middleton, announcing their arrival in Conduit Street the night before, and requesting the company of her mother and cousins the following evening. Business on Sir John's part, and a violent cold on her own, prevented their calling in Berkeley Street. The invitation was accepted, but when the hour of appointment drew near, necessary as it was, in common civility to Mrs. Jennings, that they should both attend her on such a visit. Elinor had some difficulty in persuading her sister to go, for still she had seen nothing of Willoughby, and therefore was not more indisposed for amusement abroad than unwilling to run the risk of his calling again in her absence. Elinor found, when the evening was over, that disposition is not materially altered by a change of abode. For although scarcely settled in town, Sir John had contrived to collect around him nearly 20 young people, and to amuse them with a ball. This was an affair, however, of which Lady Middleton did not approve. In the country, an unpremeditated dance was very allowable. But in London, where the reputation of elegance was more important and less easily obtained, it was risking too much for the gratification of a few girls, and to have it known that Lady Middleton had given a small dance of 8 or 9 couple with 2 violins and a mere sideboard collation. Okay. It just looks weird. Collation. The action of collating something, a light informal meal. Okay, a light informal meal in this context. And a mere sideboard collation. Mr. and Mrs. Palmer were of the party, and from the former, whom they had not seen before since their arrival in town, as he was careful to avoid the appearance of any attention to his mother-in-law, and therefore never came near her, they received no mark of recognition on their entrance. He looked at them slightly, without seeming to know who they were, and merely nodded to Mrs. Jennings from the other side of the room. Marianne gave one glance round the apartment as she entered. It was enough. He was not there, and she sat down, equally ill-disposed to receive or communicate pleasure. After they had been assembled about an hour, Mr. Palmer sauntered towards the Miss Dashwoods to express his surprise on seeing them in town, though Colonel Brandon had been first informed of their arrival at his house, and he had himself said something very droll on hearing that they were to come. "I thought you were both in Devonshire," said he. "Did you?" replied Elinor. "When do you go back again?" "I do not know," and thus ended their discourse. Never had Marianne been so unwilling to dance in her life as she was that evening, and never so much fatigued by the exercise. She complained of it as they returned to Berkeley Street. Aye, said Mrs. Jennings. "We know the reason of all that very well. If a certain person who shall be nameless had been there, you would not have been a bit tired. And, to say the truth, it was not very pretty of him to give you the meeting when he was invited." "Invited?" cried Marianne. "So my daughter Middleton told me, for it seems Sir John met him somewhere in the street this morning." Marianne said no more, but looked exceedingly hurt, impatient in this situation to be doing something that might lead to her sister's relief. Elinor resolved to write the next morning to her mother, and hoped by awakening her fears for the health of Marianne to procure those inquiries which had been so long delayed. And she was still more eagerly bent on this measure, by perceiving after breakfast on the morrow that Marianne was again writing to Willoughby, for she could not suppose it to be any other person. About the middle of the day, Mrs. Jennings went out by herself on business, and Elinor began her letter directly, while Marianne, too restless for employment, too anxious for conversation, walked from one window to the other, or sat down by the fire in melancholy meditation. Elinor was very earnest in her application to her mother, relating all that had passed, her suspicions of Willoughby's inconstancy, urging her by every plea of duty and affection to demand from Marianne an account of her real situation with respect to him. Her letter was scarcely finished when a rap foretold a visitor, and Colonel Brandon was announced. Marianne, who had seen him from the window and who hated company of any kind, left the room before he entered it. He looked more than usually grave, and though expressing satisfaction at finding Miss Dashwood alone, as if he had somewhat in particular to tell her, sat for some time without saying a word. Elinor, persuaded that he had some communication to make in which her sister was concerned, impatiently expected its opening. It was not the first time of her feeling the same kind of conviction, for more than once before, beginning with the observation of, "Your sister looks unwell today," or "Your sister seems out of spirits." He had appeared on the point either of disclosing or of inquiring something particular about her. After a pause of several minutes, their silence was broken by his asking her, in a voice of some agitation, when he was to congratulate her on the acquisition of a brother? Elinor was not prepared for such a question, and having no answer ready, was obliged to adopt the simple and common expedient of asking what he meant. He tried to smile as he replied, "Your sister's engagement to Mr. Willoughby is very generally known." "It cannot be generally known," returned Elinor, "for her own family do not know it." He looked surprised, and said, "I beg your pardon. I am afraid my inquiry has been impertinent, but I had not supposed any secrecy intended, as they openly correspond and their marriage is universally talked of." "How can that be? By whom can you have heard it mentioned?" "By many. By some of whom you know nothing. By others with whom you're most intimate, Mrs. Jennings, Mrs. Palmer, and the Middletons. But still I might not have believed it. For where the mind is perhaps rather unwilling to be convinced, it will always find something to support its doubts. If I had not, when the servant let me in today, accidentally seen a letter in his hand, directed to Mr. Willoughby in your sister's writing, I came to inquire, but I was convinced before I could ask the question. Is everything finally settled? Is it impossible to... But I have no right. I have no chance of succeeding. Excuse me, Miss Dashwood. I believe I have been wrong in saying so much, but I hardly know what to do, and on your prudence I have the strongest dependence. Tell me that it is all absolutely resolved on, that any attempt that, in short, concealment, if concealment be possible, is all that remains." These words, which conveyed to Elinor a direct avowal of his love for her sister, affected her very much. She was not immediately able to say anything, and even when her spirits were recovered, she debated for a short time on the answer it would be most proper to give. The real state of things between Willoughby and her sister was so little known to herself that, endeavoring to explain it, she might be as liable to say too much as too little. Yet, as she was convinced that Marianne's affection for Willoughby could leave no hope of Colonel Brandon's success, whatever the event of that affection might be, and at the same time wished to shield her conduct from censure, she thought it most prudent and kind, after some consideration, to say more than she really knew or believed. She acknowledged, therefore, that though she had never been informed by themselves of the terms on which they stood with each other, of their mutual affection she had no doubt, and of their correspondence she was not astonished to hear. He listened to her with silent attention, and on her ceasing to speak, rose directly from his seat, and after saying in a voice of emotion, "To your sister I wish all imaginable happiness, to Willoughby that he may endeavour to deserve her," took leave, and went away. Elinor derived no comfortable feeling from this conversation to lessen the uneasiness of her mind on other points. She was left, on the contrary, with a melancholy impression of Colonel Brandon's unhappiness, and was prevented from even wishing it removed by her anxiety for the very event that must confirm it. Nothing occurred during the next 3 or 4 days to make Eleanor... I'm already cooking. My goodness. We're on to chapter 28, and as a friendly reminder, it's been a minute. Hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack, be sure to stretch. Yep. Yeah. Do whatever it is that you need to take care of yourselves and enjoy this story. Okay. I just started going right into the next chapter and I didn't even realize it. So, stretch for me. My very old and creaky chair needs an update. I'll get one of these days. Hydrate before somebody tells me I need to. Okay. Chapter 28. Nothing occurred during the next 3 or 4 days to make Eleanor regret what she had done in applying to her mother, for Willoughby neither came nor wrote. They were engaged about the end of that time to attend Lady Middleton to a party from which Mrs. Jennings was kept away by the indisposition of her youngest daughter, and for this party, Marianne, wholly dispirited, careless of her appearance, and seeming equally indifferent whether she went or stayed, prepared without one look of hope or one expression of pleasure. She sat by the drawing-room fire after tea till the moment of Lady Middleton's arrival, without once stirring from her seat or altering her attitude, lost in her own thoughts and insensible of her sister's presence. And when at last they were told that Lady Middleton waited for them at the door, she started as if she had forgotten that anyone was expected. They arrived in due time at the place of destination, and as soon as the string of carriages before them would allow, alighted, ascended the stairs, heard their names announced from one landing place to another in an audible voice, and entered a room splendidly lit up, quite full of company, and insufferably hot. When they had paid their tribute of politeness by curtsying to the lady of the house, they were permitted to mingle in the crowd, and take their share of the heat and inconvenience, to which their arrival must necessarily add. After some time spent in saying little and doing less, Lady Middleton sat down to the casino, and as Marianne was not in spirits for moving about, she and Eleanor, luckily succeeding to chairs, placed themselves at no great distance from the table. They had not remained in this manner long, for Eleanor perceived before Eleanor perceived Willoughby, standing within a few yards of them, in earnest conversation with a very fashionable-looking young woman. She soon caught his eye, and he immediately bowed, but without attempting to speak to her or to approach Marianne, though he could not but see her, and then continued his discourse with the same lady. Eleanor turned involuntarily to Marianne, to see whether it could be unobserved by her. At that moment, she first perceived him, and her whole countenance glowing with sudden delight, she would have moved towards him instantly, had not her sister caught hold of her. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed. "He is there! He is there! Oh, why does he not look at me? Why cannot I speak to him?" Pray be composed," cried Eleanor, "and do not betray what you feel to everybody present. Perhaps he has not observed you yet." This, however, was more than she could believe herself, and to be composed at such a moment was not only beyond the reach of Marianne, it was beyond her wish. "Aw, thanks for the head pats, Lotto." She sat in an agony of impatience which affected every feature. At last he turned round again and regarded them both. She started up, and pronouncing his name in a tone of affection, held out her hand to him. He approached, and addressing himself rather to Eleanor than Marianne, as if wishing to avoid her eye and determined not to observe her attitude, inquired in a hurried manner after Mrs. Dashwood, and asked how long they had been in town. Eleanor was robbed of all presence of mind by such an address, and was unable to say a word. But the feelings of her sister were instantly expressed. Her face was crimsoned over, and she exclaimed in a voice of the greatest emotion, "Good God, Willoughby, what is the meaning of this? Have you not received my letters? Will you not shake hands with me?" Intense. "Hey, Curious, welcome in." He could not then avoid it, but her touch seemed painful to him, and he held her hand only for a moment. During all this time he was evidently struggling for composure. Eleanor watched his countenance, and saw its expression becoming more tranquil. After a moment's pause, he spoke with calmness. "I did myself the honor of calling in Berkeley Street last Tuesday, and very much regretted that I was not fortunate enough to find yourselves and Mrs. Jennings at home. My card was not lost, I hope." "But have you not received my notes?" cried Marianne, in the wildest anxiety. "Here is some mistake, I am sure, some dreadful mistake. What can be the meaning of it? Tell me, Willoughby, for heaven's sake, tell me what is the matter." He made no reply. His complexion changed, and all his embarrassment returned, but as if, on catching the eye of the young lady with whom he had been previously talking, he felt the necessity of an instant exertion, he recovered himself again, and after saying, "Yes, I had the pleasure of receiving the information of your arrival in town, which you were so good as to send to me," turned hastily away with a slight bow and joined his friend. Marianne, now looking dreadfully white, and unable to stand, sunk into her chair, and Eleanor, expecting every moment to see her faint, tried to screen her from the observation of others, while reviving her with lavender water. "Go to him, Eleanor," she said, as soon as she could speak, "and force him to come to me. Tell him I must see him again, must speak to him instantly. I cannot rest. I shall not have a moment's peace till this is explained, some dreadful misapprehension or other. Oh, go to him this moment." "How can that be done?" "No, my dearest Marianne, you must wait. This is not a place for explanations. Wait only till tomorrow." With difficulty, however, could she prevent her from following him herself, and to persuade her to check her agitation, to wait, at least with the appearance of composure, till she might speak to him with more privacy and more effect, was impossible. For Marianne continued incessantly to give way in a low voice to the misery of her feelings by exclamations of wretchedness. In a short time Eleanor saw Willoughby quit the room by the door towards the staircase, and telling Marianne that he was gone, urged the impossibility of speaking to him again that evening, as a fresh argument for her to be calm. She instantly begged her sister would entreat Lady Middleton to take them home, as she was too miserable to stay a minute longer. Lady Middleton though in the middle of a rubber, on being informed that Marianne was unwell, was too polite to object for a moment to her wish of going away, and making over her cards to a friend, they departed as soon as the carriage could be found. Scarcely a word was spoken during their return to Berkeley Street. Marianne was in a silent agony, too much oppressed even for tears, but as Mrs. Jennings was luckily not come home, they could go directly to their own room, where hartshorn restored her a little to herself. She was soon undressed and in bed, and as she seemed desirous of being alone, her sister then left her, and while she waited the return of Mrs. Jennings, had leisure enough for thinking over the past. That some kind of engagement had subsisted between Willoughby and Marianne, she could not doubt, and that Willoughby was weary of it seemed equally clear, for however Marianne might still feed her own wishes, she could not attribute such behavior to mistake or misapprehension of any kind. Nothing but a thorough change of sentiment could account for it. Her indignation would have been still stronger than it was, had she not witnessed that embarrassment which seemed to speak a consciousness of his own misconduct, and prevented her from believing him so unprincipled as to have been sporting with the affections of her sister from the first. Without any design that would bear investigation. Absence might have weakened his regard, and convenience might have determined him to overcome it. But that such a regard had formerly existed, she could not bring herself to doubt. As for Marianne, on the pangs which so unhappy a meeting must already have given her, and on those still more severe which might await her in its probable consequence, she could not reflect without the deepest concern. Her own situation gained in the comparison, for while she could esteem Edward as much as ever, however they might be divided in future, her mind might be always supported, but every circumstance that could embitter such an evil seemed uniting to heighten the misery of Marianne in a final separation from Willoughby, in an immediate and irreconcilable rupture with him. Big oof. Willoughby is like, nah, step off. Let's go. I'm not into it anymore. I wonder what he promised her, or what they got up to on their own when he was out walking with her. He took her to his house. Willoughby doing the new phone who dis. Yeah, accurate. He's like giving her the cut direct, or ghosting her terribly, or some such. Yeah, I don't know. That's wild. Very wild to me. We are between chapters. I think I have enough time to read one more chapter before we need to go on ad break. We'll be okay. We'll see how far I can get in the next 17 minutes. I'm not sure if I can fit 2, but we'll try. I might be able to snooze a little bit longer and get a little bit out of another chapter, maybe. So, all right, we're on to chapter 29. Ooh, how exciting. I think there's a total of 52? Bear with me. 50 exactly. So we are definitely past the midway point now, technically. Do the math. Yep. 10 less than 50 is 40. 41, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, and 50. So, all right. So we have a total of 50 chapters, and we are on chapter 29. Marker there. Chapter 29. Before the housemaid had lit their fire the next day, or the sun gained any power over a cold, gloomy morning in January, Marianne, only half dressed, was kneeling against one of the window seats for the sake of all the little light she could command from it, and writing as fast as a continual flow of tears would permit her. In this situation, Elinor, roused from sleep by her agitation and sobs, first perceived her, and after observing her for a few moments with silent anxiety, said in a tone of the most considerate gentleness, "Marianne, may I ask? "No, Eleanor," she replied. "Ask nothing. You will soon know all." The sort of desperate calmness with which this was said lasted no longer than while she spoke, and was immediately followed by a return of the same excessive affliction. It was some minutes before she could go on with her letter, and the frequent bursts of grief which still obliged her at intervals to withhold her pen were proofs enough of her feeling how more than probable it was that she was writing for the last time to Willoughby. Eleanor paid her every quiet and unobtrusive attention in her power, and she would have tried to soothe and tranquilize her still more, had not Marianne entreated her, with all the eagerness of the most nervous irritability, not to speak to her for the world. In such circumstances, it was better for both that they should not be long together, and the restless state of Marianne's mind not only prevented her from remaining in the room a moment after she was dressed, but requiring at once solitude and continual change of place, made her wander about the house till breakfast time, avoiding the sight of everybody. At breakfast she neither ate nor attempted to eat anything, and Eleanor's attention was then all employed, not in urging her, not in pitying her, nor in appearing to regard her, but in endeavoring to engage Mrs. Jennings' notice entirely to herself. As this was a favorite meal with Mrs. Jennings, it lasted a considerable time, and they were just setting themselves after it, round the common work table, when a letter was delivered to Marianne, which she eagerly caught from the servant, and, turning of a death-like paleness, instantly ran out of the room. Eleanor, who saw as plainly by this as if she had seen the direction that it must come from Willoughby, felt immediately such a sickness at heart as made her hardly able to hold up her head, and sat in such a general tremor as made her fear it impossible to escape Mrs. Jennings' notice. That good lady, however, saw only that Marianne had received a letter from Willoughby, which appeared to her a very good joke, and which she treated accordingly by hoping with a laugh that she would find it to her liking. Of Eleanor's distress, she was too busily employed in measuring lengths of worsted for her rug to see anything at all, and calmly continuing her talk, as soon as Marianne disappeared, she said, "And she said, 'Play the best song in the world, or I'll eat your soul.'" Sorry. It's just, "And she said," as Marianne disappeared, she said, "Upon my word, I never saw a young woman so desperately in love in my life. My girls were nothing to her, and yet they used to be foolish enough. But as for Miss Marianne, she is quite an altered creature. I hope from the bottom of my heart he won't keep her waiting much longer, for it is quite grievous to see her look so ill and forlorn. Pray, when are they to be married?" Eleanor, though never less disposed to speak than at that moment, obliged herself to answer such an attack as this, and therefore, trying to smile, replied, "And have you really, ma'am, talked yourself into a persuasion of my sister's being engaged to Mr. Willoughby? I thought it had been only a joke, but so serious a question seems to imply more, and I must beg, therefore, that you will not deceive yourself any longer. I do assure you that nothing would surprise me more than to hear of their being going to... I do assure you that nothing would surprise me more than to hear of their being going to be... Oh, that sentence is so bad. Old English. I do assure you that nothing would surprise me more than to hear of their being going to be married. For shame, Miss Dashwood, how can you talk so? Don't we all know that it must be a match? That they were over head and ears in love with each other from the first moment they met. Did not I see them together? in Devonshire every day and all day long, and did not I know that your sister came to town with me on purpose to buy wedding clothes? Come, come, this won't do. Because you are so sly about it yourself, you think nobody else has any senses? But it is no such thing, I can tell you. For it has been known all over the town this ever so long. I tell everybody of it, and so does Charlotte. Indeed, ma'am, said Eleanor very seriously, you are mistaken. Indeed, you are doing a very unkind thing in spreading the report, and you will find that you have, though you will not believe me now. Mrs. Jennings laughed again, but Eleanor had not spirits to say more, and eager at all events to know what Willoughby had written, hurried away to their room, where, on opening the door, she saw Marianne stretched on the bed, almost choked by grief, one letter in her hand and 2 or 3 others lying by her. Eleanor drew near, but without saying a word, and seating herself on the bed, took her hand, kissed her affectionately several times, and then gave way to a burst of tears, which at first was scarcely less violent than Marianne's. The latter, though unable to speak, seemed to feel all the tenderness of this behavior, and after some time thus spent in joint affliction, she put all the letters into Eleanor's hands, and then, covering her face with her handkerchief, almost screamed with agony. Eleanor, who knew that such grief, shocking as it was to witness it, must have its course, watched by her till this excess of suffering had somewhat spent itself, and then, turning eagerly to Willoughby's letter, read as follows. Hydrate. Bond Street, January. My dear Madam, I have just had the honor of receiving your letter, for which I beg to return my sincere acknowledgments. I am much concerned to find there was anything in my behavior last night that did not meet your approbation, and though I am quite at a loss to discover in what point I could be so unfortunate as to offend you, I entreat your forgiveness of what I can assure you to have been perfectly unintentional. I shall never reflect on my former acquaintance with your family in Devonshire without the most grateful pleasure, and flatter myself it will not be broken by any mistake or misapprehension of my actions. My esteem for your whole family is very sincere, but if I have been so unfortunate as to give rise to a belief of more than I felt or meant to express, I shall reproach myself for not having been more guarded in my professions of that esteem. That I should ever have meant more, you will allow to be impossible, when you understand that my affections have been long engaged elsewhere, and it will not be many weeks, I believe, before this engagement is fulfilled. It is with great regret that I obey your commands of returning the letters with which I have been honored from you, and the lock of hair which you so obligingly bestowed on me. I am, dear madam, your most obedient, humble servant, John Willoughby. With what indignation such a letter as this must be read by Miss Dashwood may be imagined. Though aware, before she began it, that it must bring a confession of his inconstancy and confirm their separation forever, she was not aware that such language could be suffered to announce it. Nor could she have supposed Willoughby capable of departing so far from the appearance of every honourable and delicate feeling, so far from the common decorum of a gentleman, as to send a letter so impudently cruel, a letter which, instead of bringing with his desire of a release any professions of regret, acknowledged no breach of faith, denied all peculiar affection whatever, a letter of which every line was an insult, and which proclaimed its writer to be deep in hardened villainy. She paused over it for some time with indignant astonishment, then read it again. And again. But every perusal only served to increase her abhorrence of the man, and so bitter were her feelings against him that she dared not trust herself to speak, lest she might wound Mary Ann still deeper by treating their disengagement not as a loss to her of any possible good, but as an escape from the worst and most irredeemable of evils, a connection for life with an unprincipled man, as a deliverance the most real, a blessing the most important. In her earnest meditations on the contents of the letter, on the depravity of that mind which could dictate it, and probably on the very different mind of a very different person, who had no other connection whatever with the affair than what her heart gave him with everything that passed, Eleanor forgot the immediate distress of her sister, forgot that she had 3 letters on her lap yet unread, and so entirely forgot how long she had been in the room, that when, on hearing a carriage drive up to the door, she went to the window to see who could be coming so unreasonably early. She was all astonishment to perceive Mrs. Jennings' chariot, which she knew had not been ordered till 1. Determined not to quit Mary Ann, though hopeless of contributing at present to her ease, she hurried away to excuse herself from attending Mrs. Jennings, on account of her sister being indisposed. Mrs. Jennings, with a thoroughly good-humored concern for its cause, admitted the excuse most readily, and Eleanor, after seeing her safe off, returned to Mary Ann, whom she had found attempting to rise from the bed, and whom she reached just in time to prevent her from falling on the floor, faint and giddy from a long want of proper rest and food. For it was many days since she had any appetite, and many nights since she had really slept. And now, when her mind was no longer supported by the fever of suspense, the consequence of all this was felt in an aching head, a weakened stomach, and a general nervous faintness. A glass of wine, which Eleanor procured for her directly, made her more comfortable, and she was at last able to express some sense of her kindness by saying, Poor Eleanor, how unhappy I make you." "I only wish," replied her sister, "there were anything I could do which might be of comfort to you." This, as everything else would have been, was too much for Mary Ann, who could only exclaim in the anguish of her heart, "Oh, Eleanor, I am miserable indeed," before her voice was entirely lost in sobs. A moment of silence for the young Mary Ann's, 16, 17-year-old heartbreak. Yeah. Sad. Eleanor could no longer witness this torrent of unresisted grief in silence. "Exert yourself, dear Mary Ann," she cried. "If you would not kill yourself and all who love you, think of your mother, think of her misery while you suffer. For her sake, you must exert yourself." I cannot, cried Mary Ann. Leave me if I distress you. Leave me, hate me, forget me. But do not torture me so. Oh, how easy for those who have no sorrow of their own to talk of exertion. Happy, happy Eleanor, you cannot have an idea of what I suffer. Do you believe me happy, Mary Ann? Ah, if you knew. And can you believe me to be so while I see you so wretched? Forgive me, throwing her arms round her sister's neck. I know you feel for me. I know what a heart you have, but yet you must be happy. Edward loves you. What can do away such happiness as that? Many, many circumstances, said Eleanor solemnly. No, cried Marianne wildly. He loves you, and only you. You can have no grief. I can have no pleasure while I see you in this state, and you will never see me otherwise. Mine is a misery which nothing can do away. You must not talk so, Marianne. Have you no comforts, no friends, and is your loss such as leaves no opening for consolation? Much as you suffer now, think of what you would have suffered if the discovery of his character had been delayed to a later period. If your engagement had been carried on for months and months, as it might have been before he chose to put an end to it. Every additional day of unhappy confidence on your side would have made the blow more dreadful. Engagement, cried Marianne. There has been no engagement. No engagement? No, he is not so unworthy as you believe him. He has broken no faith with me. But he told you that he loved you? Yes, no, never absolutely. It was every day implied, but never professedly declared. Sometimes I thought it had been, but it never was. Yet you wrote to him. Yes. Could that be wrong after all that had passed? But I cannot talk. Elinor said no more, and turning again to the 3 letters which now raised a much stronger curiosity than before, directly ran over the contents of all. The first, which was what his sister had sent him on their arrival in town, was to this effect. Berkeley Street, January. How surprised you will be, Willoughby, on receiving this. I think you will feel something more than surprise when you know I am in town. An opportunity of coming hither, though, with Mrs. Jennings, was a temptation we could not resist. I wish you may receive this in time to come here tonight, but I will not depend on it. At any rate, I shall expect you tomorrow. For the present, adieu. M.D. Or for Marianne Dashwood. Okay. Her second note, which had been written on the morning after the dance at the Middletons, was in these words. I cannot express my disappointment in having missed you the day before yesterday, nor my astonishment at not having received any answer to a note which I sent you above a week ago. I have been expecting to hear from you, and still more to see you, every hour of the day. Pray call again as soon as possible, and explain the reason of my having expected this in vain. You had better come earlier another time, because we are generally out by 1. We were last night at Lady Middleton's, where there was a dance. I have been told that you were asked to be of the party, but could it be so? You must be very much altered indeed since we parted, if that could be the case, and you not there. But I will not suppose this possible, and I hope very soon to receive your personal assurance of its being otherwise. M.D. The contents of her last note to him were these. What am I to imagine, Willoughby, by your behavior last night? Again, I demand an explanation of it. I was prepared to meet you with the pleasure which our separation naturally produced, with the familiarity which our intimacy at Barton appeared to me to justify. I was repulsed indeed. I have passed a wretched night in endeavoring to excuse a conduct which can scarcely be called less than insulting. But though I have not yet been able to form any reasonable apology for your behavior, I am perfectly ready to hear your justification of it. You have perhaps been misinformed or purposely deceived in something concerning me, which may have lowered me in your opinion. Tell me what it is. Explain the grounds on which you acted, and I shall be satisfied in being able to satisfy you. It would grieve me indeed to be obliged to think ill of you, but if I am to do it, if I am to learn that you are not what we have hitherto believed, that your regard for us all was insincere, that your behavior to me was intended only to deceive, let it be told as soon as possible. My feelings are at present in a state of dreadful indecision. I wish to acquit you, but certainty on either side will be ease to what I now suffer. If your sentiments are no longer what they were, you will return my notes and the lock of my hair, which is in your possession. M.D. Oof. Big oof. That such letters, so full of affection and confidence, could have been so answered, Eleanor, for Willoughby's sake, would have been unwilling to believe. But her condemnation of him did not blind her to the impropriety of their having been written at all, and she was silently grieving over the imprudence which had hazarded such unsolicited proofs of tenderness, not warranted by anything preceding, and most severely condemned by the event, when Marianne, perceiving that she had finished the letters, observed to her that they contained nothing but what anyone would have written in the same situation. I felt myself, she added, to be as solemnly engaged to him as if the strictest legal covenant had bound us to each other. I can believe it, said Eleanor, but unfortunately he did not feel the same. He did feel the same, Eleanor. For weeks and weeks he felt it. I know he did. Whatever may have changed him now, and nothing but the blackest art employed against me can have done it. I was once as dear to him as my own soul could wish. This lock of hair, which now he can so readily give up, was begged of me with the most earnest supplication. Had you seen his look, his manner, had you heard his voice at that moment, have you forgot the last evening of our being together at Barton, the morning that we parted too, when he told me that it might be many weeks before we met again, his distress? Can I ever forget his distress? For a moment or two, she could say no more, but when this emotion had passed away, she added in a firmer tone, Eleanor, I have been cruelly used, but not by Willoughby. Dearest Marianne, who but himself, by whom can he have been instigated? By all the world rather than by his own heart. I could rather believe every creature of my acquaintance leagued together to ruin me in his opinion than believe his nature capable of such cruelty. This woman of whom he writes, whoever she is, whoever she be, or any one, in short, but your own dear self, mamma, and Edward, may have been so barbarous as to belie me. Beyond you three, is there a creature in the world whom I would not rather suspect of evil than Willoughby, whose heart I know so well? Eleanor would not contend, and only replied, Whoever may have been so detestably your enemy, let them be cheated of their malignant triumph, my dear sister, by seeing how nobly the consciousness of your own innocence and good intentions supports your spirits. It is reasonable and laudable pride which resists such malevolence. No, no, cried Marianne, misery such as mine has no pride. I care not who knows that I am wretched. The triumph of seeing me so may be open to all the world. Eleanor, Eleanor, they who suffer little may be proud and independent as they like, may resist insult or return mortification. But I cannot. I must feel. I must be wretched. And they are welcome to enjoy the consciousness of it that can. But for my mother's sake, and mine, I would do more than for my own, but to appear happy when I am so miserable. Oh, who can require it? Again they were both silent. Eleanor was employed in walking thoughtfully from fire to the window, from the window to the fire, from the window to the wall, without knowing what she received warmth from one, or discerning objects through the other, and Marianne, seated at the foot of the bed, with her head leaning against one of its posts, again took up Willoughby's letter, and after shuddering over every sentence, exclaimed, It is too much. Oh, Willoughby, Willoughby, could this be yours? Cruel, cruel, nothing can acquit you. Eleanor, nothing can. Whatever he might have heard against me, ought be not to have suspended his belief? Ought he not to have told me of it, to have given me the power of clearing myself? The lock of hair, repeating it from the letter, which you so obligingly bestowed on me, that is unpardonable. Willoughby, where was your heart when you wrote those words? Oh, barbarously insolent. Eleanor. Can he be justified? No, Marianne, in no possible way. And yet this woman, who knows what her art may have been, how long it may have been premeditated, how deeply contrived by her, who is she? Who can she be? Whom did I ever hear him talk of as young and attractive among his female acquaintance? Oh, no one, no one. He talked to me only of myself. Another pause ensued. Marianne was greatly agitated, and it ended thus. Eleanor, I must go home. I must go and comfort Mamma. Cannot we be gone tomorrow? Tomorrow, Marianne. Yes. Why should I stay here? I came only for Willoughby's sake, and now who cares for me? Who regards me? It would be impossible to go tomorrow. We owe Mrs. Jennings much more than civility, and civility of commonest kind must prevent such a hasty removal as that. Well then, another day or two perhaps, but I cannot stay here long. I cannot stay to endure the questions and remarks of all these people, the Middletons and Palmers. How am I to bear their pity? The pity of such a woman as Lady Middleton. Oh, what would he say to that? Eleanor advised her to lie down again, and for a moment she did so. But no attitude could give her ease, and in restless pain of mind and body she moved from one posture to another, till, growing more and more hysterical, her sister could with difficulty keep her on the bed at all, and for some time was fearful of being constrained to call for assistance. Some lavender drops, however, which she was at length persuaded to take, were of use, and from that time till Mrs. Jennings returned, she continued on the bed quiet and motionless. Oh, man. Oh, that poor kid. I mean, he was the one asking her for her lock of hair. He begged her for it. He's like, I need some sign of your affection. Made promises without actually promising anything. And now here we are in town with him otherwise engaged with someone else and being a jerk. That's sad. Okay, well, we're at a point right now where I'm going to need to go on an ad break. We finished chapter 29. We'll move on to 30 when I come back. And then we'll get through a few chapters. Let's see what we can get through in the next hour or so. And then, yeah, we'll call it quits and find somebody to raid. Hopefully in our new category, which if you are, Maiko, I'm not sure if you saw this yet. We have a new category. Bear with me a second. Let me grab that. It is writing and reading, which is super cool. Can I grab that? I think I had that somewhere up there. Aha! I'll pin it. Did that work? I don't know. I'm not used to pinning anything. There we go. Ha! I found it. I did it. I think that's the first time I've ever pinned anything in chat. Okay. When I come back, we'll start on chapter 30. So hang tight, everybody. Thank you for listening. While I'm gone, hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack, do whatever you need to relax and enjoy the story when I return. Hello, everyone, and we're back. You lovely Librophiles. We're going to continue with Sense and Sensibility, and we'll read about an hour's worth more of content. Maybe a little less. Just kind of feeling a little bit tired, a little bit spent. This week has been very long, and it's only Wednesday. Ugh. So, whole big mood. I'm really excited to say that we are past the halfway point in the book, though. That is really nice. Let's see here. Just checking notification real quick. Before I pursue reading the next chapter, I know that most of you here probably know who Iron Mouse is. I just want to throw out there, she is one of the most amazing creators, supports a ton of artists, and she's an amazing human being. And I love that she supports people with immunodeficiency. She herself also suffers from immunodeficiency, and I hope that someday I'm able to support a variety of charities in that demographic, perhaps immunodeficiency, libraries and reading, and access to literature is like my go-to. But she's awesome, and I've been seeing a lot of stuff on Twitter. A lot of hate has been thrown her way on YouTube, like getting her, I think it was her VOD channel, taken down. None of it makes a lick of sense. She's a genuinely good person. So if you're not familiar with the content, I would definitely say check her out. Let me do a little shout out to her real quick. I know it's in the greater scheme of things. Let's see. Shout out at Iron Mouse. I'm sure almost everyone here has seen her, but I just want to see something of her content because it's just, she's so funny and sweet and kind, and yeah. Anyway, you guys will see in a second. If I did it correctly, that is the question. Pretty sure I did it correctly. Maybe I didn't. I'm pretty sure I did. Maybe I can't shout her out for some reason. Twitch.tv/ironmouse. Yeah, that works a little bit different than what I was looking for. My exclamation point shout out is actually supposed to show a little, yeah, thank you. It does show a little blurb because when I just do the / it just goes to their page. But since Twitch Guru seems to be having a stroke, I'm gonna say that we'll just do it the old-fashioned way. Wow. All right, Iron Mousey. Let's see if that one works. Should. We'll try it. Yeah. Like I said, amazing content creator, sets the bar so high in energy and quality, and is just, you know, one of the good ones. So if you're not already following them, give them a chance. Check them out. Honestly, highly entertaining. So anyway, I will get back to reading. you all, yeah. All right, here we go. So we're on to chapter 30. Mrs. Jennings came immediately to their room on her return, and without waiting to have her request of admittance answered, opened the door and walked in with a look of real concern. "How do you do, my dear?" said she in a voice of great compassion to Marianne, who turned away her face without attempting to answer. "How is she, Miss Dashwood? Poor thing, she looks very bad, no wonder. Ay, it is but too true. He is to be married very soon, a good-for-nothing fellow. I have no patience with him. Mrs. Taylor told me of it half an hour ago, and she was told it by a particular friend of Miss Grey herself, else I am sure I should not have believed it. And I was almost ready to sink as it was. Well, said I, all I can say is, that if it is true, he has used a young lady of my acquaintance abominably ill, and I wish, with all my soul, his wife may plague his heart out. And so I shall always say, my dear, you may depend on it, I have no notion of men's going on in this way, and if ever I meet him again, I will give him such a dressing as he has not had this many a day. But there is one comfort, my dear Miss Marianne. He is not the only young man in the world worth having, and with your pretty face, you will never want admirers." Well, poor thing, I won't disturb her any longer, for she had better have her cry out at once, and have done with it. The Parrys and Sandersons luckily are coming tonight, you know, and that will amuse her. Oh, thank you. She then went away, walking on tiptoe out of the room, as if she supposed her young friend's affliction could be increased by noise. Marianne, to the surprise of her sister, determined on dining with them. Elinor even advised her against it. But no, she would go down. She could bear it very well, and the bustle about her would be less. Elinor pleased to have her governed for a moment by such a motive, though believing it hardly possible that she could sit out the dinner, said no more, and adjusting her dress for her as well as she could while Marianne still remained on the bed, was ready to assist her into the dining-room as soon as they were summoned to it. When there, though looking most wretchedly, she ate more and was calmer than her sister had expected. Had she tried to speak, or had she been conscious of half Mrs. Jennings' well-meant but ill-judged attentions to her, this calmness could not have been maintained. But not a syllable escaped her lips, and the abstraction of her thoughts preserved her in ignorance of everything that was passing before her. Elinor, who did justice to Mrs. Jennings' kindness, though its effusions were often distressing, and sometimes almost ridiculous, made her those acknowledgments and returned her those civilities which her sister could not make or return for herself. Their good friend saw that Marianne was unhappy, and felt that everything was due to her which might make her at all less so. She treated her, therefore, with all the indulgent fondness of a parent towards a favorite child on the last day of its holidays. Marianne was to have the best place by the fire, was to be tempted to eat by every delicacy in the house, and to be amused by the relation of all the news of the day, had not Elinor, in the sad countenance of her sister, seen a check to all mirth. She could have been entertained by Mrs. Jennings' endeavours to cure a disappointment in love by a variety of sweetmeats and olives and a good fire. As soon, however, as the consciousness of all this was forced by continual repetition on Marianne, she could stay no longer. With an hasty exclamation of misery and a sign to her sister not to follow her, she directly got up and hurried out of the room. Peachtree McGee. Can any book be read on Twitch, or is it just classical literature? It depends on who you ask. From what we were able to ascertain at the Ancestral Library, that is a group of booktubers, I guess, readers. Neff Durath, the lore keeper, put together a list of other booktubers. Some of them read classic literature. A lot of them read a variety of things. Myko Psycho, who might be in chat, I'm not sure. He reads like scientific journals and philosophy. It was pretty fascinating. Lady Fox, I believe, was reading most recently. I can't recall. It's been a minute. My brain is so full of so many things at the moment. So Lady Fox, she's been reading other fiction as far as I'm aware. We have a list of booktubers, so if anybody wanted to be added to that list, let me grab the link for that so we can put that in the chat. Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive list. We've been adding to it for months, but yeah, it's just a so the list I'm posting is the list for the booktubers. Now, as far as we know, what Neff was able to ascertain was that because it is all credits are being attributed to the author, and you're not making a derivative of their work, but you are performing their work under the California law, it's considered a performance. Aw, thanks, Peachtree. It's considered a performance, and therefore it is not illegal. I started this project, I shouldn't say project, whatever VTubing is, job, I guess. I don't know, it's sharing my love of books with everyone from around the world, right? So it's more than a hobby, less than a job, whatever. I can't think of the word at the second. But since I started streaming books and being a VTuber, I have personally made it my, I want to read classic literature. One, because early on, before I found out that you technically can read anything without copyright and violation, I still want to one, share the classics, because I feel like a lot of people never got exposed to them, and there's so many books that were written in the last 100 years that needs to be revisited, some of which have language I don't approve of, but the history is still there and important for inspiration and for new authors to come up with new ideas, right? But yeah, I was very hesitant to cover anything besides classic literature, because I was so worried about copyright infringement. But most of the booktubers that I've seen, I haven't seen anybody hit with a copyright that's reading, gosh, I think Fox was reading, Persinger, Aragon series, I think. And then Neff has been reading some Brandon Sanderson. Let me think here. Bill and Alan the Duck, or no, Alan Bill the Duck. We're reading some fiction as well. Yeah. Oh, okay, good. I was worried for a second there, Peachtree. But yeah, it's just an ongoing list of VTubers. that do reading of some kind. Speaking of which, there was somebody early in chat. Bear with me. I will find you somewhere in the craziness. They had a blue name, I think. Shioviti. Haha, they were doing sewing. I need to add them to the list. So. And also give them a follow. Because all of us booktubers need to stick together. Let's see. Put that over there. Okay, so back to it. Oh, that's funny. My mama is calling me at present. I will let her know that I'm still streaming. Give me a second. Will call after. Well, now I have more incentive to finish closer to the hour. So we'll get through the next couple chapters and see where we get by 9 p.m. Eastern. Poor soul, cried Mrs. Jennings as soon as she was gone. How it grieves me to see her, and I declare if she is not gone away without finishing her And I declare if she is not gone away without finishing her wine, and the dried cherries too. Yum. Lord, nothing seems to do her any good. I am sure if I knew of anything she would like, I would send all over the town for it. Well, it is the oddest thing to me that a man should use such a pretty girl so ill. But when there is plenty of money on one side and next to none on the other, Lord bless you, they care no more about such things. The lady, then, Miss Grey, I think you called her, is very rich? 50,000 pounds, my dear. Did you ever see her? A smart, stylish girl, they say, but not handsome. I remember her aunt very well, Biddy Henshaw. She married a very wealthy man, but the family are all rich together. 50,000 pounds. And, by all accounts, it won't come before it's wanted, for they say he is all to pieces. No wonder, dashing about with his curricle and hunters. Well, it don't signify talking, but when a young man, be he who he will, comes and makes love to a pretty girl and promises marriage, he has no business to fly off from his word only because he grows poor and a richer girl is ready to have him. Why, don't he in such a case sell his horses, let his house, turn off his servants, and make a thorough reform at once? I warrant you, Miss Marianne would have been ready to wait till matters came round, but that won't do nowadays. Nothing in the way of pleasure can ever be given up by the young men of this age. Do you know what kind of girl Miss Grey is? Is she said to be amiable? I never heard any harm of her. Indeed, I hardly ever heard her mentioned, except that Mrs. Taylor did say this morning that one day Miss Walker hinted to her that she believed Mr. and Mrs. Ellison would not be sorry to have Miss Grey married, for she and Mrs. Ellison could never agree. And who are the Ellisons? Her guardians, my dear. But now she is of age and may choose for herself, and a pretty choice she has made. What now? After pausing a moment, your poor sister has gone to her own room, I suppose, to moan by herself. Is there nothing one can get to comfort her? Poor dear! It seems quite cruel to let her be alone. Well, by and by we shall have a few friends, and that will amuse her a little. What shall we play at? She hates whist, I know. But is there no round game she cares for? Dear ma'am, this kindness is quite unnecessary. Marianne, I dare say, will not leave her room again this evening. I shall persuade her, if I can, to go early to bed, and for I am sure she wants rest. I believe that will be best for her. Let her name her own supper and go to bed. Lord, no wonder she has been looking so bad and so cast down this last week or two. For this matter, I suppose, has been hanging over her head as long as that. And so the letter that came today finished it. Poor soul. I am sure if I had had a notion of it, I would not have joked her about it for all my money. But then, you know, how should I guess such a thing? I made sure of its being nothing but a common love letter, and you know young people like to be laughed at about them. Do they? Lord, how concerned Sir John and my daughters will be when they hear it. If I had had my senses about me, I might have called in Conduit Street in my way home, and told them of it, but I shall see them tomorrow. It would be unnecessary, I am sure, for you to caution Mrs. Palmer and Sir John against ever naming Mr. Willoughby, or making the slightest allusion to what has passed before my sister. Their own good nature must point out to them the real cruelty of appearing to know anything about it when she is present. And the less that may ever be said to myself on the subject, the more my feelings will be spared, as you, my dear madam, will easily believe. Oh, Lord, yes, that I do indeed. It must be terrible for you to hear it talked of. And as for your sister, I am sure I would not mention a word about it to her for the world. You saw I did not all dinner time. For no more would Sir John nor my daughters, for they are all very thoughtful and considerate. Are they? Especially if I give them a hint, as I certainly will. For my part, I think the less that is said about such things the better. The sooner 'tis blown over and forgot. And what good does talking ever do, you know? In this affair it can only do harm, more so perhaps than in many cases of a similar kind, for it has been attended by circumstances which, for the sake of everyone concerned in it, make it unfit to become the public conversation. I must do this justice to Mr. Willoughby. He has broken no positive engagement with my sister. Law, my dear, don't pretend to defend him. No positive engagement, indeed. After taking her all over Allenham House and fixing on the very rooms they were to live in hereafter. Eleanor, for her sister's sake, could not press the subject farther, and she hoped it was not required of her for Willoughby's, since, though Marianne might lose much, he could gain very little by the enforcement of the real truth. After a short silence on both sides, Mrs. Jennings, with all her natural hilarity, burst forth again. Well, my dear, 'tis a true saying about an ill wind, for it will be all the better for Colonel Brandon. He will have her at last. Aye, that he will. Mind me. Now, if they ain't married by midsummer, Lord, how he'll chuckle over this news. I hope you will come tonight. It will be all to one a better match for your sister. 2,000 a year without debt or drawback, except the little love-child indeed. I had forgot her. But she may be prenticed out at small cost, and then what does it signify? Delaford is a nice place, I can tell you, exactly what I call a nice old-fashioned place, full of comforts and conveniences, quite shut in with great garden walls that are covered with the best fruit trees in the country, and such a mulberry tree in one corner. Ooh, yum. Lord, how Charlotte and I did stuff the only time we were there. Then there is a dovecot some delightful stew ponds, and a very pretty canal, and everything, in short, that one could wish for, and moreover, it is close to the church and only a quarter of a mile from the turnpike road, so 'tis never dull. For if you only go and sit up in an old yew arbor behind the house, you may see all the carriages that pass along. Oh, 'tis a nice place. A butcher hard by in the village, and the parsonage house within a stone's throw. To my fancy, 1,000 times prettier than Barton Park, where they are forced to send 3 miles for their meat, and have not a neighbor nearer than your mother. Well, I shall spirit up the colonel as soon as I can. One shoulder of mutton, you know, drives another down. If we but put Willoughby out of her head. Aye, if we can but do that, ma'am, said Eleanor, we shall do very well with or without Colonel Brandon. And then, rising, she went away to join Marianne, whom she found, as she expected, in her own room, leaning in silent misery over the small remains of a fire which, till Eleanor's entrance, had been her only light. You had better leave me, was all the notice that her sister received from her. I will leave you, said Eleanor, if you will go to bed. But this, from the momentary perverseness of impatient suffering, she at first refused to do. Her sister's earnest, though gentle persuasion, however, soon softened her to compliance. And Eleanor saw her lay her aching head on the pillow, and saw her, as she hoped, in a way to get some quiet rest before she left her. In the drawing-room, whither she then repaired, she was soon joined by Mrs. Jennings, with a wine-glass full of something in her hand. My dear, said she, entering, I have just recollected that I have some of the finest old Castagna wine. I have some of the finest old Castagna wine in the house that ever was tasted. So I have brought a glass of it for your sister, my poor husband. How fond he was of it, whenever he had a touch of his old colicky gout. He said it did him more good than anything else in the world. Do take it to your sister. Dear ma'am, replied Eleanor, smiling at the difference of the complaints for which it was recommended. How good you are! But I have just left Marianne in bed, and I hope almost asleep. And as I think nothing will be of so much service to her as rest, if you will give me leave, I will drink the wine myself. You could not make a Jane Austen book today, as people under the age of 20 are drinking. The drinking age in the UK is still 18. You absolutely could. It's just here in America that it's 21. With, as crazy as Americans are when we drink, when we're that young and dumb, it's just, I can see why it's 21. They had talked about it a while back, about reducing the age of for alcohol, but nothing ever came of it. It's such a minor matter when such bigger things are involved right now. Also, welcome back, Almontes. I'm not sure how long you've been listening, but welcome in. Mrs. Jennings, though regretting that she had not been 5 minutes earlier, was satisfied with the compromise, and Eleanor, as she swallowed the chief of it, reflected that, though its good effects on a colicky gout were at present of little importance to her, its healing powers on a disappointed heart might be reasonably tried on herself as on her sister. Colonel Brandon came in while the party were at tea, and by his manner of looking round the room for Marianne, Eleanor immediately fancied that he neither expected nor wished to see her there, and, in short, that he was already aware of what occasioned her absence. Mrs. Jennings was not struck by the same thought, for soon after his entrance she walked across the room to the tea-table where Eleanor presided and whispered, colonel looks as grave as ever, you see. He knows nothing of it. Do tell him, my dear. He shortly afterwards drew a chair close to hers, and with a look which perfectly assured her of his good information, inquired after her sister. Marianne is not well, said she. She has been indisposed all day, and we have persuaded her to go to bed. Perhaps, then, he hesitantly replied, what I heard this morning may be true. There may be more truth in it than I could believe possible at first. What did you hear? That a gentleman whom I had reason to think, in short, that a man whom I knew to be engaged. But how shall I tell you? If you know it already, as surely you must, I may be spared. You mean, answered Eleanor with forced calmness, Mr. Willoughby's marriage with Miss Grey? Yes, we do know it all. This seems to have been a day of general elucidation, for this very morning first unfolded it to us. Mr. Willoughby is unfathomable. There we go. Mr. Willoughby is unfathomable. Where did you hear it? In a stationer's shop in Pall Mall, where I had business. Two ladies were waiting for their carriage, and one of them was giving the other an account of the intended match, in a voice so little attempting concealment that it was tequila, that it was impossible for me not to hear it all. The name of Willoughby, John Willoughby, frequently repeated, first caught my attention, and what followed was a positive assertion that everything was now finally settled respecting his marriage with Miss Grey. It was no longer to be a secret. It would take place even within a few weeks, with many particulars of preparation and other matters. One thing especially I remember, because it served to identify the man still more. As soon as the ceremony was over, they were to go to Combe Magna, his seat in Somersetshire. My astonishment. But it would be impossible to describe what I felt. The communicative oh man, that's so hard to say for some reason. The communicative lady, the communicative why communicative, my goodness. The communicative lady, I learnt on inquiry, for I stayed in the shop till they were gone, was a Mrs. Ellison, and that, as I have been since informed, is the name of Miss Grey's guardian. It is. But have you likewise heard that Miss Grey has £50,000? In that, if in anything, we may find an explanation. It may be so, but Willoughby is capable, at least I think. He stopped a moment, then added in a voice which seemed to distrust itself, and your sister, how did she? Her sufferings have been very severe. I have only to hope that they may be proportionably short. It is a most cruel affliction. Till yesterday, I believe she never doubted his regard, and even now, perhaps. But I am almost convinced that he never was really attached to her. He has been very deceitful, and in some points there seems a hardness of heart about him. Ah, said Colonel Brandon, there is indeed, but your sister does not. I think you said so. She does not consider it quite as you do? You know her disposition, and may believe how eagerly she would still justify him if she could. He made no answer. And soon afterwards, by the removal of the tea things and the arrangement of the card parties, the subject was necessarily dropped. Mrs. Jennings, who had watched them with pleasure while they were talking, and who expected to see the effect of Miss Dashwood's communication in such an instantaneous gaiety on Colonel Brandon's side as might have become a man in the bloom of youth, of hope, and happiness saw him, with amazement, remain the whole evening more serious and thoughtful than usual. As I am quite certain we cannot finish the next chapter in 5 minutes, we will take that 5 minutes to find someone to raid. Who do we have here? Let's see. Wow, OBS, why are you so poopy? I'm gonna have to reconfigure my scenes. I think I attended a webinar in Underrealm Games, which, if you guys are not familiar with, is an amazing community. Let's see. So we've got, there is Canadian Dr. Seuss reread. Oh, that's fun. Same category. It's so exciting to use a category that is dedicated to what we do here. Change plans looks like looking at books while using the new category. We have a home, novel writing, reading Andrew Physics fanfic. We have a category, purple monkey dishwasher, pass it on. Maiko, never change. J'écris des tous pour Age of Olympia. Interesting. I do not think we should go just jumping into a French stream, but noted. I don't know, I feel like Dr. Seuss would be really fun, but it would be nice to like stick to Hearth and Home. Novel writing, I like their layout, is kind of cool. I think Atropa Everwood, random change of plans. Let's look at books while using the new category. Looks like they have some really nice ones. They are not a VTuber. Well, no, they are a VTuber. It looks like they have a PNG over hand cam. They're looking at some really beautiful books. So, 1 second. Let's go say hello. Now, today's, perhaps we shall raid. We shall say, what shall we say? We'll do the raid with, one of these days I'm gonna get that written down. I know I will. Man, OBS, are you just having a stroke? I swear. Okay, well, we'll figure that out here in a second. Okay. This is very frustrating because OBS is poop. Hi. Oh, that is a struggle. Something is cooking my CPU. I have definitely got to rework my OBS scenes. Since that C++ upgrade, it has been jank. I'll be honest. Okay. Leaving with more sensibility than sense. Hi, House. Welcome in. You are a little bit. About 3 hours since when I started. You guys, if you haven't checked out House, they're an amazing creator here. I really love their artwork. I don't know when the last time you streamed was, House, but I love your art, and people should check it out. We're leaving with more sensibility, with all the heart feels for poor Miss Marianne today. Okay, I think that's a good one. Yeah, I'm using up like 60% of my CPU. Something is not right in my computer. We shall have to address that after stream. After I call my mom. Oh man, too many things to remember. Call mom. Okay. Okay, here will be our raid message, if it works. If OBS will post the message. Do 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 do. I should. I'll figure it out one of these days. So that is the raid message. Be sure to grab that, and we're gonna go raid that super nice new friend who is looking at beautiful books. Go Go Gadget OBS. Woo! Okay. Hang on tight while we raid out 1 second.